Thank you for having the opportunity to share a bit about the work that we do at ETH. And yeah, let's dive right into this. I will talk a bit about how we are thinking at the moment about robot morphologies, how we want to build robots of the future, and how we could maybe rethink some of the assumptions we have made in the past about robotic designs, about robotic control. But to start, let me take this quote from Joanna. Joanna is a novelist. She enjoys writing books. She's not an engineer. She's not a scientist. And what she said is, you know what's the biggest problem with pushing all things AI? Wrong direction. I want AI to do my laundry and dishes so that I can do the art and writing. I don't want AI to do my art and writing so that I have to do the laundry and the dishes. And I think she has something to say here, which is quite relevant. So we can obviously use ChatGPT and other tools these days to really make our life easier when it comes to writing these manuscripts or our emails. But like pushing the limit of what our robots can do, I think there's lots of open space to work in this. So what do robots already do for us today? Where do they help us in terms of home and at work? What comes to your mind? Toasters? Oh, that's an interesting robot. This is the first. I've not heard this one before. Okay. I'm not sure how much autonomy is in the toaster. The ontology of toast. Okay. Any other robots that you can think of? Roombas, vacuums, yeah. Obviously this is a robot. This is the robot that we know. It's going to weld your other like cars and autonomous vehicles. But there's the Roomba, or there's these vacuum cleaners, or these the robots that will wipe your floor. And then there's also these creatures. I think you call that one Clifford, I learned today. Because it's red and it's like a robot dog Clifford. It's actually for us, it's our home robot from Zurich, right? It's the animal. But one thing they don't do is they do interactions with the world. They don't really do that yet. I mean, they may be vacuuming or they touch the floor or something, or they maybe make a perfectly welded line. But the more messy things, like for example, handling bakery items or doing surgery or even, doing the fulfillment center duties that currently an army of labor workers are doing, all of these things require interactions, even restocking our shelves in the supermarket. So the question is, why is it so hard for this embodied AI that Joanna wants to see? Why is it so hard for them to interact with the world? Well, there's already people doing this. You might have seen Boston Dynamics picking up plates from a car, taking it from one side to another to help in the assembly line. Figure AI does something like this too. They actually they're trying to do the dishes for Joanna. In this case, it's just a mock setup. And there's billions, today I learned it's about 50 billions, going into this space for AI, for object manipulation. And I'm thinking, like, if the robot would do this in my kitchen, I wouldn't want to stand next to it. So it is a bit scary to think about the current technologies we use, the metal machinery, the motors and all of this coming into the design. It's going to actually be quite painful. So is this design ready to safely interact with us? Not really, right? So we need to rethink the robot's morphology. And one way you can think about this is we could bring together the ideas from multiple worlds. So we could look at soft robots. Soft robots is something I've looked a lot so far in my past into, which is just to build robots to make them soft for the sake of softness. I remember many years ago sitting in a car with Usama Khatib here from Stanford, and he was asking me, Robert, why are you building soft robots? What's the point of them? Like, they can't really do anything. Like, they're so soft. And I mean, I think there is something to be said about they can maybe not handle high payloads, but they do have something to say. If they interact with you, they're not going to hurt you. Steve was also telling me today, the soft grippers that could be on the end effector of a robot, they can actually, at least for that realm of the robot, when it touches you and hits you, not really cause as much damage as a rigid gripper. But then they can do the payload capacity of a rigid robot. A rigid robot can actually lift weights, it can move over rough terrain, and it can be quite sturdy. And then there is nature. Nature, that's us, that's the animals. That's what we have in nature. It's a musculoskeletal design. So what can we do to bring together the the insights from all of these worlds to build these hybrid robots, these robots that have an inspiration from the musculoskeletal design idea, but also from taking the softness of the soft robotic world to build these muscles and other soft tissues. And in the end, have a robot that can both carry payloads, but also can be gentle and can be adapted to the environment. So its mechanical impedance can be better matched with the actual world. Like yesterday, for example, I saw a booster robotics robot. I think you also have one here. I saw it earlier in the center. When you turn it on and have it walk around, it's really loud. It's hitting the floor and stomping around. And it's just because there's many, many things you can do with a musculoskeletal design that rigid robots with its motors can do. So today I will be talking about a couple of ideas in this space. So first, I want to talk about the most extreme ends of what we're looking into, which is to actually build muscles from cells. And then I will talk about what are challenges that we face there, and even quickly mention what could be even medical implications of learning about tissue engineering with biological cells that help for robotics, but maybe also beyond this. And then I will talk about musculoskeletal designs. So taking not just from one muscle, but thinking about many muscles and what are the challenges there, towards making them actually more feasible and untethered, towards the question of how can we produce all of it, not just the muscles, but also the whole structure. And then what are the autonomy challenges there? Like how can I actually showcase these designs that I can do something autonomously? Because if I just build something, show it a great design, but it doesn't do anything, you won't necessarily give up that unitary robots that you are already having in your lab. So what can we take inspiration from? Obviously, I can take my hands, I can take an arm, I can take a leg, I can look at the human anatomy, and I can ask myself, what are the key elements that make it function and work? It's the muscle. The muscle moves it all. The muscle makes the key ingredient, in my opinion, of a robot. If I don't have an actuator, in this case a muscle, it's not really a robot. But then I also need other parts. I need the bones, I need the tendons, and I need the joints, and I need the ligaments. So we need to come up with solutions for all of this and the interplay of all of this to build our future robots. We have started to look a lot into muscles because we see the biggest lack in the musculoskeletal area is we don't have good muscles to build these robots from. So let me spend a lot of time on this today. So the first thing, as I mentioned already, is we have a part of our group that just asked the question, can we build robots that are made of cells? So can we build muscles that actually use cells? And this is not your hypothetical cell on the computer that you simulate. No, I'm talking here about using the cell from animals. And now the question is why? Why would I want to go this route? Mark, why would I want to use cells?
Isn't it crazy that we can speak, walk, run, bicycle by eating 2 hamburgers of food a day? The way we process energy and move is really efficient.
Yes. So the way that we take in energy is drastically different to the humanoids that we see right now. They have to have a battery, but the cells, we take our hamburgers. Or maybe other healthier foods, but like, yes, definitely. So, if I were to look at a few points that people would say, these are the features that we want to really make use of when we work with cells, then it is the self-repair, the ability for cells, for many cells to come together and eventually in a swarm arrangement to assemble, to self-repair, to be self-sensing. So cells have multiple capabilities. They're not just, for example, a muscle, but they can also have proprioception. And they're also inherently soft. So it meets the requirement that as a soft roboticist, I like to see cells can be soft if they are not becoming a bone. And they can also be sustainable and eco-compliant. So I'm using organic material that goes into the machinery and it produces the structure. I don't need to necessarily, if I find fully sustainable ways, produce a lot of waste with these robots. So when we look at this, how should we go about this? So basically, we look at a muscle, and a muscle consists of all of these individual myoblasts that you start off with, and you could culture them in a petri dish. And well, this doesn't really give you a muscle yet if I just throw them randomly in there. So you have to come up with ways of bringing them into a structure that can be a muscle. So one way of doing it is you take a hydrogel and you throw so-called stem or progenitor cells into the hydrogel, and with the right differentiation protocols applied to it and maturation protocols, you can actually build up muscle fibers. So in the interest of time, let me dive directly into my favorite project that we're doing right now. And this is work that one of the PhD students in my group is doing. Her name is Aa289. And she has been looking into how can we make a combination of these muscles with a structure that can actually be a robot. So what she does is she basically creates scaffolds, and these scaffolds are made with a printing technique called xylography. You see the scaffold up there on the left. It's basically a long rectangular structure with lots of small grooves on the order of 100 micrometers. And this structure allows, when we place the cells on top of it, a mix of slurry, I will get to it in a moment, to align along those grooves and also to restructure this whole scaffold and eventually makes a swimmer out of this. So we have this construct and we have a printer that uses two wavelengths. These two wavelengths go into a bath, and wherever two wavelengths hit, it takes a photoinitiator. That photoinitiator becomes active because of the two wavelengths. And at that point, it causes a polymerization of the hydrogel. So we use this to build these scaffolds, and then we put the cells on top. And I can tell you right now, we're also working on projects where we not put them on top, but we directly put them in there. But this will be for the future. But for now, let me talk about this. So we have basically the scaffold, we have the cells, and then in the end, we get the scaffold with the cells seated on top. And we start at day 0. Down there, you see the construct. It has the scaffold underneath. It has the cells on top. And then as the procedure in the differentiation goes along and the matrix gets remodeled, the matrix starts to shrink. And so the whole thing starts to bend into this U-shaped form. That's because these muscles, they start to fuse, they start coming together. And as the days pass by, we eventually end up with this construct that is really bent into shape. And the muscle has matured, and now we can start playing around with it. So we're going from myoblasts towards these myofibers. When you get it wrong, that's what you get. So if you get a too soft of an underlying scaffold that is not surviving, we would say it has a poor survival of the maturation process, you end up with these slightly dysfunctional swimmers. If you get the mix right for the scaffold, you can actually get a pretty good proper swimming behavior from it. And it swims, I will get to this in a moment, because we give it a stimulus that causes the muscle to contract, and we can pace that stimulus, we can control it. So Aa289 went ahead and she tried different frequencies. She wanted to see what happens if I go at different frequencies with this construct. So if I go at 1 hertz, what ends up happening is we have these slow swimmers that can travel a short distance in a longer time. As I go up in frequency, you get more faster swimming behavior in the Petri dish. And here, this is going up to 3 hertz and then 4 hertz. And then eventually I greedily go up to 5 hertz and it gets slower. It's still a bit faster than 4 hertz. It swims out of the frame faster, so that's why the line is shorter. And now the question to you, if I greedily go up to a higher frequency, what happens? Slower. Why? Okay. Viscosity, friction, okay. All right. Any other guesses? Yeah.
I think it might paralyze because the stimulation is too high.
Yes. Yes. It cramps. It kind of goes into tetanus. So that's what we get here. This little one that's just sort of like, sorry, I can't do this anymore. You're overstimulating me. This is too much. I can't handle this. So yes, it does not anymore swim. And it's interesting. So you can start learning about these muscle constructs and how they behave without actually having to harm an animal. So I want to just mention here, we actually never killed an animal for this experiment. We just got a cell line from a supplier that has immortalized the cell line, and we can just passage it and multiply more and more of these and use it for this experiment. So this is a close-up from the 5 hertz swimmer. So over there you see the electrode that gives an electrostatic field at 5 hertz. Every 1/5 seconds, we give a 1% stimulus. And that means for that 1%, it will get a short stimulus, a 1% duty cycle, and then it will start its contraction, and then it will eventually relax again, and then the next one comes. And so this is what happens here with the swimming. Yes?
What happens when you increase the amplitude?
Well, it doesn't really, at some point you start electrocuting the cells in some way, but we haven't gone too high with this. It's just a trigger. The energy comes from the nutrients. It doesn't come from the electrical field. So when we look at this swimmer, we compared it to other sort of biohybrid ideas and directions, and we found we got a much higher body length per minute swimming speed with this design. And so now we're investigating this area even further, and we're trying to understand, for example, can we model the behavior here? Can we understand why does it swim this? Can we understand the swimming behavior, the interactions of the surrounding fluid with the construct, and why it actually swims? Can we also do optimization of these structures by changing the length of the muscle relative to the length of the scaffold, and allow us to study why and if this model is actually accurate compared to an experiment that we built. And so this is all work in progress, and it becomes a nice playground for us to learn about these biohybrid systems. Another problem is perfusion. Perfusion means how can we actually make this muscle be thicker and thicker and bigger? Because in the end, we don't want to just have sort of a couple of hundreds of micrometers of a muscle, but we want to have really centimeter thick muscle or more. And so what we're doing here is we want to understand what happens when we put in channels into a structure. Because if you don't put channels in there, you will have dying cells in the core of your muscle construct. All of our muscles have a perfusion system, and this allows our muscles to be actually take away waste products and carry oxygen and nutrients to your muscle. And so the same thing we do here. So if I look into a muscle construct that has no perfusion channels, what we will see is that we have maybe 150 micrometers of somewhat built up myotubes, which is going to give you contractions. And the deeper I go into the construct up here, these are all dead cells. And this is bad, right? I don't just want to greedily build a big construct. If it actually doesn't get nutrients, it will not survive, and it won't give me power and won't give me muscle power. So Miriam started looking into this, and she's like, hey, let's actually make a construct that we extrude both the myoplast, but also an anchor structure on each side. And then we also interlace perfusion channels that can also afterwards be removed. And with this experiment, we basically take a muscle, we run a dye through it, and we want to see how quickly does this muscle become pinkish, become in this color. So we take constructs with channels and without channels, and just naturally gravity-driven perfusion already. And we just take the construct, lay it at an angle, place our nutrients with a dye, the nutrient solution on top, and we get, within a minute or so, we get already perfusion through the construct, which we wouldn't get without the channels. And another thing we see in this study is, so 6 days into the maturation process, we still don't have fully built up muscle fibers, and we still have these white channels that we produced initially. But as it further matures, these channels get thinner and thinner. So that's because of the shrinking and the remodeling that the cells are doing to the hydrogel matrix. So that's not even accounted for in these models that just showed you. We haven't really accounted for the maturation process that goes from an initial design to a matured muscle that has completely reshaped itself. So we're still a long way away from using these actuators to build this. You see there's lots of muscles in a human leg. And and they're really big. The thing I just showed to you here, this is on the order of 1 to 2 centimeters in size. And we want to build muscles that are much larger than this, right? So one thing that we have been looking into is using hydraulically amplified self-healing electrostatic actuators, which is kind of a mouthful, also just simply called hazels. And this is something that Christoph Keplinger's group at UC Boulder, when he was still UC Boulder, developed. And we've been using this as a starting point for musculoskeletal designs that are taking electrical energy from a battery and directly placing it into contractional. We want to go away from this principle of taking electrical energy into an electromagnetic motor, into a pump, then flowing liquid into a structure. We believe this is way less efficient and more bulky. So this principle here basically takes these pouches that you see on the left, and then when you apply charges onto these electrodes, they act like a capacitor that is soft, that will zip together, and it will cause the whole construct to shorten. And that's your muscle, basically. The muscle now lifts the weight up. So this is how it looks like in real. This is using two dielectric films, and then we place on it a carbon. We put a little bit of carbon electrode material on the outside, and then we put opposite charges on each side, and as I then apply voltage, it lifts up a weight over there. So the first thing we tried with this is we made a fish. And that's always a nice thing to start off with, because we don't have to worry about gravity. We can just throw it into the liquid, and we can try it out. But we had a few problems with this here. So one thing that you can't quite see is we are not swimming in water. Let me ask you why. It's conductive. And why is this a problem? Yeah, so the electrodes in the original Hazel design, they're just exposed, and you don't really want them to be in a conductive liquid. So we started swimming in oil. But swimming in oil is actually quite bad. It's not so easy to swim in oil as compared to water. Have you ever tried to swim in oil? Probably better this way, not to swim in oil. But so this fish had to swim in oil, and it also had multiple electrodes that come in here. And so that lets me point to the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is there's these humongous power supplies that sit on the outside. And people usually don't like to show them because they're not very attractive to talk about robots that will discover the world, but there's this huge power supply. So we then started going, first we tried to things outside of water to see, can we use the Hazel design to build legs towards the idea of a musculoskeletal design. So here, this is sort of our baseline system. We call it a joint-centered system or a joint-centered design, where we take an electromagnetic motor and we place it into each joint, and then we basically run current through these electromagnetic motor units. It's a brushless motor, and then it moves around. This is what you know from the current humanoids. And we built everything the same way as we built in the second our Hazel system. So here we have the motor, we have an encoder in there, so we can also know where we are in terms of positioning. And we need this, otherwise it doesn't work. And then we build a musculoskeletal system. Here, we ditch the motor. The rest of the carbon fiber structure remains the same. And then we place a ton of muscles, Hazel muscles in there, that basically now become our antagonist muscle units that allow our leg to be pulling antagonistically with a lever arm onto our structure. And so this is the Hazel on the right side. We call it self-sensing because essentially it allows us to sense the contraction and also to sense the change of capacitance under loading. And so basically the way you can think about this, on the left side we have the electromagnetic motors, and on the right side we have the Hazel muscles. These are our actuators. Then we have, on the left side, we would use usually just joint angle encoders. And the right side, we can make do with just the self-sensing capacity, the self-sensing capability of the capacitors. And then finally, on the left side, you usually would have a linear transmission that could be a planetary gearbox or some other way of taking the high rotations per minute and the lower torque to translate it up to a higher torque and the lower rotations per minute, which you need often for robotic applications. And we don't need this. We just use different nonlinear moment arms for our tendons to attach to, the same way that we do it in our human body. Or maybe Mother Nature does it in our human body. So this is the Pelé system, and it has the hip flexor, the hip extensor, the knee extensor, and the knee flexor. So we have these 2 degrees of freedom in the system. Then we have 4 high voltage amplifier units. And we also do packaging of these muscles. And the way you can think about the design rule for this is if you stack the pouches in series, you get more strain, more delta X. If you put more on top of each other, you get more force. This is how you can basically design your muscle unit in this case. So when you flex the hip, it moves the tip down in the yellow line, and then you extend the knee, it moves it further, and so forth. So we go through the full motion cycle with the tip. And now let's get to some experiments. So Thomas then started looking together with Toshi on how agile is the system, how adaptive, also how efficient, and how does self-sensing work for the system. So when we look at agility, we try to do, for example, high jump experiments. Well, just see, can this thing actually hop off the ground? And how does it hop off the ground and how are the impact forces once I lift off and I land again. So this let us already study the system from that perspective. And then we also looked into how fast can I actually run this. So I can actuate this at 0.5 hertz and I get a certain motion cycle. And I can go faster here. So I can, for example, go to 3 hertz and I get a fairly, this is a slow speed, I get 3 hertz, I get a fairly large motion cycle. But as I go up in speed from 3 hertz, I will eventually see I can go even faster and we get a smaller motion cycle. So 5 hertz already, you see the motion range goes down. And we can run this all the way up to 10 hertz. So this is actually quite agile. Actually, let me run this again. So this is 10 hertz. So the thing can be run quite fast just by charging and discharging the muscle. But we get a fairly small motion range. And I get to this in a moment, what causes a limitation to the motion range when you have 2 muscles pull onto the structure. So now we tried an open loop experiment where we put it onto a boom. And now the leg is hopping our little garden. So this is like the lab garden environment with, a cactus. That's probably the only, and a proper plant. That's probably the plants you can easily maintain in the lab. And you see the leg is actually capable of going over different type of terrain, not using any closed loop control. All we're doing is we're changing the signal that you see on the top between the actuation of the leg extensor and the leg flexor. And that allows it to hop over it with a hopping gait and go over the terrain. And we can also try this obviously for other surfaces and see how well it hops on these surfaces. And we can also try different hopping modes. So here is the speed mode where we can do a very long stride. But we can also do the efficiency mode where we use less energy. So it's overall from a cost of transport, the more efficient mode. And then there's also this one. That's like the crawler. That's actually the most efficient mode because I don't have to take off. I just crawl forward. But it only works because I take the rubber tip off the foot, so I have a little bit of better grip going down on the surface, and I don't have a rough terrain. So then we looked at the cost of transport, and then we also looked at, in the cost of transport, we found we were quite good, at least for the system that we looked at in terms of a single foot compared to land animals. And then here we looked at the heating. So on the left side is the motor that we compare to, and the right side is the muscle. And the motor heats up quite a bit because we constantly run current to hold the payload. And on the right side, it does not require this. So this allowed us to do investigations into efficiency as well. And then there's another thing where we looked into the self-sensing muscle. So we want to understand, can we actually use the capacitive change of the muscle to detect an obstacle? So here's the obstacle on the left side. That's just a stone. And now the robot is just hopping in a normal gait, and then it hits against the stone. It senses a change in its capacitance, and it changes its gait cycle. So this allowed us to, here you see the capacitance change. So the moment it makes contact, we get a different capacitance profile for hitting against the stone. And then we just change to a different controller that lets this leg hop over the stone. Then we also looked into what if we not only use the muscle by itself with its capacitor, but we can actually, nothing speaks against still to use an encoder. Like, why not? Like, why not have an encoder in the joints as well? So then we try to see, can we track different motion cycles? Like, can we do a circle? Could we do a figure 8 and different sort of motions? And how accurately could we track a reference trajectory with the tip? And one thing we found in this experiment, so we were able to track it, but we had a fairly limited motion range. Now the question to you is, why? Why is, in the setup that I just showed you with this Pelé leg, what's the challenge in terms of motion range? Like, why is the motion range that you see here sort of limited to a small motion range in the tip of the leg? It's not able to do these large motions. I can do this with my arm, right? I can do quite large motions with the tip of my finger. So what is mechanically the challenge here? The muscle. And what's the problem with the muscle? Why can I not do this?
It's a single isotropy material, so it can contract or extend as far as much as the muscle.
So it cannot contract, but particularly it cannot extend as far as our muscle can. So it can contract. It can actually, technically, you can collapse this muscle. Passively, you can collapse it because it will just fold up or buckle up. But the problem comes, and you see this now here, if I take the muscle and I pull on it, it doesn't extend. It's a film. It's a flexible film, but it's not really an extensible film. If I pull really hard on it, I just rip it apart. But it doesn't really, it's not elastic, right? So if I look at this from, let's say, the motion range that you see here with the actual natural muscle, is that we have the challenge that if I want to go to the right terrain where, let's say, animals would have their muscle also be at, I would have to actually be extensible. So down there is the length over the length, the resting length, L0. And natural muscle can be both contracted actively, while you see my triceps down there was right now extended to allow this to happen. And that's not possible with this design. So then Amir and Ronan thought about what's the problem here? The problem was that, so we have on the top, we have the two muscles. This little cross in there just says the muscle is not really extensible. And then if I take the tendons and I tighten them, ideally for a good system, they are tightened properly. If I do this, then I get no motion range. Because I'm trying to contract one muscle, the other one will not give in and it won't allow me to do this. But if I now put a little bit of slack onto the tendon, I get some motion. And that's exactly what we did for the Pelé system. We put a little bit of slack in there, so we get that motion. But you can imagine that's not very good from a controls perspective, and it's also not a very efficient way of doing it. So what we started doing is to say, why don't we take the muscle and couple it with a clutch? And the clutch itself is basically something that can selectively engage and let go, the same way in your car, that would be the case. But also it has an elastic fabric around it that takes the clutch back once there's no loading on it. So the way this looks like, we have the hazel on the top, we call it the electrostatic muscle. And on the bottom, here, in this pinkish red color, that's the fabric. And inside of the fabric sits two PVDF clutch units that are basically two dielectric materials with electrodes. And then you apply a voltage, and they will like really stick together and become a closed unit. And if I take the voltage apart, they can freely slide. And the only resisting force then becomes the pouch, this like pinkish unit around it, which extends, okay? So what happens here is, so you see on the left side, I do muscles without clutches. And then you get a limited motion range. You have just some slack in there. And on the right side, if I actually use the clutch, I can get a much larger motion range. So you can imagine me now using this to build the follow-up generations of the Pelé system. So we get larger motion ranges and we can actually start building humanoids or even just bipedal or quadrupedal systems from this. So let's get back to the elephant in the room. What was the elephant in the room again? Yes, that's the elephant here. So the elephant in the room is quite big. It's actually as big as you see it on here. It's a massive unit. So it sits in our lab. We have a couple of these. They easily set you back with like $20,000 US if you buy one of these. So there's lots of good reasons to get rid of them. They're way too heavy and they're way too expensive. And the reason why they're actually so big is because no one ever cared about having a smaller high voltage power supply. There was no application that needed it. So if I actually go and build a unit for my design, and I think about what to combine here in terms of step-up conversion and in terms of switching units that can turn on and off the current onto your capacitors, you can get it 5,000 times smaller. So we went actually from, on the left side, 25 kg to 15 grams to power our robot. But in order to do this, we had to also think about how can we now build muscles that can actually work with this. So that was a challenge that we got interested in terms of we can, for example, build a muscle unit that can use this, but it cannot go quite as high up. We found that the MOSFETs over there can commercially be purchased for voltages up to 4 kilovolts. So far, hazels were always operated at 6 to 8 to 10 kilovolts in that range to get any reasonable forces out of them. So that's a problem. So why is that? Because at those high voltages, they use other means, for example, optocouplers, they're called. They're using an optical signal and they couple, and that is actually very energy hungry. It's bulky, it's big. So we went to buy these DC-DC converters for 1 kilovolts, and we bought MOSFETs, which were really compact, but we had to go back to the design of hazels. So hazels are designed like this. The traditional hazel design. So we have an electrode, then we have a dielectric, in this case a BOPT in the middle, And then we have some oil in between. So when the thing is sipped, it looks like this. So I'm just showing you the little excerpt up there in the top. We're talking here about 10 micrometers for the electrode and about 10 micrometers for the functional layer that sort of isolates the charges and it acts as a dielectric. Now, I can replace this and move this BOPT to the outside, have an electrode, and then I have a different material that's shown here in red, and that's called PVDF terpolymer. That PVDF terpolymer has a higher effective dielectric constant that allows us to now go down in the operating voltage while we remain at a high force. So with this, we then made a muscle called HALF, which stands for hydraulically amplified low voltage electrostatic actuators. And with this composite design where we have these multiple layers, we could build a muscle that now gives us a couple of advantages. First of all, the electrodes are actually now insulated, so I could put this also underwater. And I also have the low operating voltage. How does this look like? So from an actuation voltage perspective, if I operate at, let's say, 1 kilovolts up to 1.5 kilovolts, I very conveniently are in the regime of low voltage components. So from industry norms, from power electronics industry norms, anything below 1.5 kilovolts is considered to be low voltage. So this has a certain advantage to operate at this regime. And the other thing is, with these muscles, we were able to go to powers of like 80 watts per kg, which is very comparable to a human muscle in terms of average specific power. Our hazers over there, they run all the way somewhere over there to like 8 kilovolts to do the same thing. So now we made a muscle that you can touch. We also have a swimmer that would use 2 of these muscles in there. And then we have this little gripper that holds onto an object. That was our first test cases to see how well we can use these muscles. And we are building now on the follow-up systems to use these muscles in the designs that we're interested in so that we can build robotic systems that operate at like 1 kilovolts or 1.5 kilovolts with the compact electronics and reaping the benefits from this design. Okay, so I talked a lot about muscle, but there's other things in robotic systems to actually achieve musculoskeletal designs. And as I said before, these are ligaments, joints, tendons, and bones. So one of the systems in nature is our hand that has a lot of that in a very compact space. And if I want to assemble or build them, it's quite tedious to make this, and it takes a lot of time to actually assemble it. So if we manually assemble robotic hands in our lab, it takes us multiple days to do a good job at that. So we wanted to figure out what we can do to actually speed up this process and actually build the design, this is the skeleton view, with all of these things in there except for the muscle. So this is Thomas's hand. And if you scan a human hand, you can basically take its skeletal structure out of it, and you can then place artificially capsules and ligaments around each joint. And you can additionally also put tendons in there, and even little like pressure units, hollow cavity units that you see on the fingertips to make a hand. And while you're at it, you can also try to design a heart that has soft and rigid components and valves, and even a soft robotic, rigid, soft walker that has muscles that can be pressurized. So with this, we sort of developed together with a team in Boston a system called vision-controlled shedding. And in this work, we tried to understand, can we put a ton of droplets down of soft and rigid materials? But these materials have to be actually functional. They cannot just degrade over time. They cannot have poor material properties. And so in order to achieve this, we had to find a way of not depositing the material and then scraping it off, but actually depositing and scanning the surface to then adjust in a closed loop manner every layer that we print with this inkjet method. So you see a print head here that deposits a layer. And when you deposit, there's always some unevenness. And traditionally, you would actually take a scraper or a roller to flatten it out. But you cannot do this if the material that you're putting down is not properly curing right when the UV light shines on it. It doesn't work. It will goo up your system, and it will not actually yield the properties that you want. So what we developed here is basically we have a system that can be printed, and then you scan every layer. And so you print layer by layer, and every layer is slightly adjusted to achieve what you want to achieve. So you go from original design to these layers. And so you start off, you want to print the next layer of this hand. So there is like soft and rigid and wax materials that you see here. I scan the surface and I realize, oh, there's some areas I've under-chatted and there are some areas I've over-chatted because the piezo nozzles have a distribution of particle sizes that come out of it. And then my layer, originally which was supposed to be this, I slightly adjusted to be this. So that on average I stay level without ever touching the surface. So that's the key here. So with this, I can now print other chemistries. Now the chemistries that I can print can actually do their job over long periods of time. They don't need to anymore be sort of radically polymerizing. They can take their time to polymerize. It gives you better properties overall. So instead of using an acrylate, which say a traditional Stratasys convex printer would give you, would be used, and these are so-called chain growth polymers that use a random and irregular distribution of monomers to then connect when it polymerizes. We can go to epoxies, siolines, and other materials that use something called step growth polymerization. And that material has lots of advantages in terms of material properties. So one of them is it doesn't age. So the elastic modulus, the Young's modulus, remains constant even after days and weeks. It doesn't change. While these acrylates change, they get much stiffer over time. Another thing is the elongation to break will remain what it was at the start when you printed it. It will not get more fragile and easy to break. Also, the Young's modulus, which you see in orange, is much smaller. So that means when you squeeze this material, it actually goes back and is not very viscoelastic. So the soft material actually behaves like a proper rubber as you want it to behave. So this is a walker that we printed with this, and then we just run a couple of pressure lines from the back that causes the legs to move, and then it touches, and then it senses that it picks up this box, or this tic-tac box, and then it moves backwards. And then the other thing is we printed this hand, and this hand was printed with the printed ligaments to it. And down here, we attach lines to it to pull on these printed ligaments to just actuate. We want to see, can we get this hand that we scanned to be actuated? So, and as a next step, we also put little muscles in there. This is pneumatic McKibben muscles to actuate it. And as we were assembling this, we were still taking, in this case, about an hour to assemble this whole unit. So this is Stefan here in a speed up assembling this unit, and it was still taking an hour. And as we were doing this, we were also thinking of, is this actually going to be the final solution that we want to have to build robust robots? And the answer is not yet. There's still more to be done on the material chemistry. The process now exists, but the material chemistry has to even further improve. So we started looking into building robotic hands also still from an FDM printed design, because we believe it's easier to democratize these designs. So that you, for example, could start running your Isaac Sim or Mujoko simulations to train your PPO reinforcement learning algorithm. And then you can, for example, roll them out on a hand that can be actuated, and they can learn to roll the ball forward and then change direction to roll it backwards, all just trained in simulation and applied to this hand. And you could also then start using these hands to, for example, run a transformer on it. You give it a couple of demonstrations, and then it will learn to pick up this octopus and put it into a box. And you can still annoy it if you want to, and try to see if it can still go for it. So this is what the guys then went off to mimic. They were very interested in doing a startup out of this, and they want to solve a couple of problems in industry. For example, picking up bottles or picking up items from an assembly line. But one thing that we have not really solved here yet, and I'm very curious to hear about the solutions to this, is how to put tactile feedback into these systems that they can actually sense with their fingertips. We haven't really done a good job on this yet. And also how we can basically, oh, by the way, I want to just mention here, this user she got her fingertips numbed for this experiment. So she only sees the matches, she doesn't feel them. And she has quite a hard time, as you can see, to light the match. So it takes her a long time to pick up a match and to actually light it. And we are getting interested in building these designs and also then building systems that we can teleoperate to, for example, do manipulation of objects and teach objects this way. And one other thing that we're getting interested in is also not just understanding how to build these hands that can then manipulate the world, but how do you also sense the world around us that is deformable and soft so we can better manipulate these objects around us. So one of the things that Jujo is doing is she's trying to understand, can we, for example, poke at items and deform them and make a system that can actually give us a data set so we can have learning algorithms that look at the scene and predict the deformation behavior and give you measures that you can use for your downstream tasks. So here you can, for example, take a soft cube. This is the actual like point cloud data from it. And we can do this with many objects. So we can try to learn the deformation of these objects and put them into a data set. And then eventually we can start learning with point cloud data, image sequences, and the force data from poking at the objects, a data set that could, for example, in the end, predict deformed meshes. So you could use this then for the manipulation problem of doing better manipulation with deformable objects. Okay, so just I want to highlight maybe two more things why ETH is really great. You have excellent teams of students, and one of them was a project that I started working on with a focus project team a few years ago, which is this gripper from the air, which basically has two soft grippers that can go down and pick up objects. And the team went on to actually build grippers that can also fly outside and pick objects. So here you see the drone outside on Höngerberg campus trying to pick up this plush down there. So it has an onboard detection stack that is segmenting the scene and trying to find where the object is. And then it goes for it and picks it up. And similarly, we also have now systems like this drone. Oops. This is another project by focus project students. So this third-year bachelor built a full 5-meter fixed-wing drone to go after poachers in Africa. That's sort of their goal with this project. And I can tell you there's an extreme level of independence and of capability to build up these systems. So quickly to mention, there's a few things I've covered today, which is these biohybrid swimmers. We looked at muscles. We looked at the leg systems, at these half actuators, and also at vision-controlled shedding. And we also looked at autonomous learning, meaning how can you build systems that can in the end be autonomous and manipulate objects. And in the future, we want to understand how we can build perfusion systems for the muscles, how we can do muscle modeling, how we can also do proprioception into these hands, and also how we can do really proper real-world autonomy. And maybe one thing to highlight in this context is we can not only build robots, I mentioned this to you before, but we can also look into building systems that go beyond this. And I want to give you one example here that does this. So this is something that Lewis is doing in our group, where he's taking a different printing technique where we not necessarily, in this case, have the goal of building a muscle that contracts, but we want to build something that we can use, for example, for medical application. So Lewis has been taking a technique that shines a laser onto the gel and with a certain speckle pattern that produces cell alignments. And if you then use cardiomyocytes for this, you can start producing muscle tissue, cardiomyocyte tissue that can be shined. You can shine in multiple directions on the construct, and you can produce multiple alignments of cardiomyocytes in the construct. And then when you look at this, it is a contractive tissue that can also then start contracting if you shine with two directions on it, that can contract and torque. And when you then take a step further, you can take it to applications where, for example, you have a ventricular defect where you have a hole in the heart. And then Lewis starts looking at this of how can I make sort of a metamaterial where I combine techniques from what I just showed you, where I take the cardiomyocytes with a strong structure and I put them onto patches, and then I will start installing them into defective hearts. So the next one I might not want to show you. It's pretty bloody, but so if you mind looking away, if you can see blood, I want to show you just 2 or 3 images to show you sort of the applications to this. So this is a punched hole into a pig heart that basically in this place you have a hole into the ventricle. And then when you now take the patch that Lewis developed, you can suture it back in, you can close up the heart, but now you have not just a patch that is sort of dead, so it's like made of a dead material, but it actually has the proper iPSC-derived cardiomyocytes in there, and we have the hope that this will help to at least heal that part of the construct. And then in the end, we can take it out again. We can look at what comes out of it. What is the actual like patch, and what does the actual interior look like? So with this, I want to say thanks to the team. So this is the people that did all of this work. They it's a mix of specialties from biology to biochemistry to mechanical engineering, but also to computer science and people just coming from data science that are interested in building these biohybrid musculoskeletal robots. That's how we fund ourselves. That is the funding that actually enables this research and it makes us happening. And now I'm open for questions. Thank you. So this is a broad field excitement. So the answer, no, it's not controllable because I just apply one stimulus through the Petri dish and it contracts. Asia, she's working on the question of can I place motor neurons into this construct and can I then stimulate the motor neurons selectively to give it, for example, 2 or 3 areas of contraction. Other people have looked into this. They've used, for example, optogenetically engineered cells. And then they selectively shine light onto their construct to understand to contract areas selectively. Good point, good question. Yes?
Fantastic talk.
Thank you.
I was curious, you had mentioned that using high dielectric constant, like PVF polymer, lets these Hazel actuators achieve the muscle-like force densities per unit mass.
Yeah.
But the form factor is wider and thinner than normal muscle.
Yeah.
Can you also achieve muscle-like force densities per unit volume? Or what's the pathway towards that?
Good question. So that's for the Hazels, right? Yeah. So in the case of Hazels, we find it easiest to deal with sheets because you can do thin film techniques to make these sheets and then stack them and then inject the oil afterwards. I didn't show you the fabrication process. And then you put them layered up. So if I now want to throw them into my arm, that's probably not going to fly because I have to put many muscles down in there to actually make a powerful forearm. So at the moment we are thinking of, can we move towards cylindrical designs, that we produce cylindrical designs from the get-go instead of flat designs? And then can we think about maybe not just using electrostatic forces, but really use Maxwell's equations to its full extent and maybe also embrace electromagnetic forces just as much to produce maybe muscles that can do both, to be powerful under a certain current loading, but also be strong in holding under a certain electrostatic charge that you give onto your electrodes. Yes?
Do you have any problems with cycling or sparking occurring with your actuators? I think sometimes high voltages you could break down or
Yes.
growth or something like that occurring.
So if I buy industrial manufactured sheets, I usually have only this issue when I go too high in voltage, or if if it over time fatigues, then I would get a breakdown. But at that moment, the thing is just dead, so it doesn't actuate anymore. This actually happened when we went to India and wanted to do a live demo on the stage where we wanted to show the hopping leg. We had the leg many runs. We ran it many times. And Thomas, the student, the PhD student working on this, he was every single time for all of the rehearsals was perfect. It always hopped. It was all nice. And over there, Benedek, who was working in the robotic hand demo, it was always something not working. And then and we actually went on the stage and turned on the machine and we're about to people coming back from the break. The robot hand was perfectly, beautifully doing its thing. And Thomas was like, it's not hopping. It's not working. So we went off the stage and the dancer who was next in the program went on the stage, who was very upset about this. And Thomas basically opened up the stack of muscles. And what happens in the Hazels is you can just go over them and you feel for oil. And you can identify the muscle that has had a breakdown. And then you feel, okay, there is oil. So he then unstrung the tendon from that one layer, took it out, and he had a bunch of backups and threw them back in. So that was, in this case, the failure mode. And I mean, it was either an over voltage that he ran onto this or something that caused it to break down. The other thing that we found with half actuators, with these low voltage actuators, is we are making everything there by ourselves. We cannot buy the actual dielectric films because we only can buy pellets of these PVDF polymers. And so here it goes really back to we have to move into the clean room to make them because otherwise we're introducing small little particles during the plate coating procedure and then these are in there and they will cause very easily breakdown. So that's a challenge. That's a great question. Any other questions? Yes?
What are the major differences between how muscles implement extensibility and your fluctuation?
Okay. So muscles, have the ability for the sarcomere units to have the actin myosin to actually interact and do the contraction motion. But once you let go or it stops having use up as ATP to hold this connection, you can pull it apart. There's nothing, and I think there's an elastic coupling, I forgot the name, in the sarcomere unit that allows it to also be pulled apart to a certain extent. And that gives it this like over its resting length extensibility. But it's using ATP to do this in the skeletal muscle. We don't do this in the electrostatic actuators, right? There we just use charges that cause the sipping, this hydraulically amplification. And you would have to have somehow integrated the clutch unit into the hazel to somewhat mimic this interlaced sarcomere structure, I guess. Here we sort of demodularized it. So we have the clutch on the one end, and then we have the hazel on the other end. Yeah. There was also a question, right?
When the self-sensing in the gate-changing case,
Yeah.
did you pre-program two gates in OSAT to demonstrate that it's able to sense when to switch, or did it also figure out what the new gate should be?
It's in this case we just use two gates. Yeah.
Fascinating talk, by the way.
Thank you.
For your muscles, do you have a way to decouple the amount of contract and the amount of force exerted by it?
Yes. So for the muscles, we have a way of achieving. We can play with the voltage. Are you talking about the biohybrid or about the electrohydraulics?
Or just both?
Both. Yeah. So for the biohybrid, we trigger it and it contracts. We have very little controllability there at the moment, I would say. For the electrohydraulic, when we modulate the voltage, we get different amounts of sipping and also strength. And we can actually properly model this. And we're working on models where we take individual half units and hazel units and we're characterizing them for the voltage to strain and strength behavior to actually get a model that can predict based on the voltage and based on the loading of how much contractions to get from it.
So you think that the voltage will control both the amount of contraction and the amount of force exerted?
Well, it's coupled in some way, right? If I go higher in the voltage, without any loading, I get it's sort of the same way as in the motor. You have the free spinning modes and the load-free mode, and you have the blocking force mode. In the same way, you could characterize this muscle, actually. We actually also have muscle testers that you allow to do both strain and force testing that we can couple with these muscles. The muscle tester itself will allow it to run to simulate different weights and changes of weights that are pulled onto the muscle.
Do you think there is an application to decouple these two things, or not really?
I think the problem is it's always load dependent. That's just mechanically how it is, right? So if I have a certain dynamic or static loads, the muscle itself, depending on how much force, how much actuation I give it, will be able to lift it more or less. So strain and force is always coupled given on the design and given on the input that you give to it.